Hey, Shalom Aleichem. Good morning, everybody. This is Rabbi Sayani, and we're going to discuss this morning a little bit of some aspects of the 9 days and some of the laws of Tisha B'Av coming up, as well as we're going to discuss Parshas Devarim, namely um, as it applies to Shabbos Chazon this week, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. Um, so, of course, we have what's called the Tlata Puranuta, the 3 weeks of Haftorahs, beginning with Divrei Yirmiyahu. Last week was Shimon Devar Hashem. Although there is a discussion when you know there's a discussion that when you have Shabbos Rosh Chodesh falling throughout the Talat Paranuta, do you say the Haftorah of Shimon Devar Hashem, which is it's the continuation of Dir Yirmiyahu, right? It's sort of this prolonged prophecy from Jeremiah um, in 2 parts. That week, do you read that? Do you read the Haftorah that would ordinarily be read on Shabbos Rosh Chodesh? Um, some would include some traditions, like according to the Aruch Shulchan and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, say that you should read the Rosh Chodesh Haftorah, which we did last week. Sfardim would say to read Shema Devar Hashem, but to include some verses from the Rosh Chodesh Haftorah, different customs. But nonetheless, it's universal that always the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av we read Chazon Yeshayahu from the first 27 verses of Isaiah's prophecy, um, which, is another, stunning rebuke of the Jewish people for having gone astray. Um, so before we get into the Parsha, we'll um, we'll discuss some of the aspects of Tisha B'Av, and of course, this year is given for Shlema, for Delay Bas Freidel, for Chaya Bas Yibas and for anybody else who is in need of a refuah shlema. Um, so as far as the 9 days go, so the 9 days between Rosh Chodesh Av, which was Shabbat, and Tisha B'Av, those 9 days are sort of a period of Avelus, a period of mourning for the Jewish people. The Mishnah in Masechet Ta'anit, Daf Chav Vav Amud Beit, says Mishnich Nasav Mematin B'Simcha, that when the month of Av comes in, we reduce our joy. This is the opposite of, we say Mishnich Nasav Marbin B'Simcha, that during the month of Adar we increase the Simcha, we increase the joy. Here we're doing the opposite. And Rav Papa says, Rav Papa makes this point. He says actually that because of this nature of the month, right, there's not only, Tisha B'Av kept as a fast day, but it also is, um, there also was this period of mourning for the first 9 days. So, Vishinich Nisav Mematin B'Simcha, we reduce Simcha when the month of Av comes in. Shabbat Shal Tisha B'Av Liyot B'toch Hasur B'Saper U'Mechabes, V'chanishim Adrim B'Pnei Kavod HaShabbat. Erev Tisha B'Av Lo Yochel Adam Shnei Tavshilin Lo Yochel Basav Lo Yishtei Yayin, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer Yeshane, Rabbi Yehuda Mechayev B'Chviyat Chavita V'lo Chodu Lo Chachamim. So In Tanit, it says that, what do we do to decrease acts of joy? So he says during the week in which Tisha B'Av occurs, and and this will be crucial. What we see this year, the Shavua Shechalbo, the week in which Tisha B'Av occurs, it's prohibited to cut one's hair and to launder clothing. Tisha B'Av were to occur on Friday. Then on Thursday, we're allowed to do these things out of covet for Shabbos. On the ninth, on Erev Tisha B'Av. So this is talking about the laws of the Sudat HaMafseket, right? We have the Sudat HaMafseket, we have that final meal before the fast begins. You're not allowed to have two cooked dishes in one meal, nor can you have meat or wine. Um, and you're supposed to adjust and decrease the amount you eat. Rabbi Yehuda says one should overturn the bed and sleep on the floor like a mourner. The rabbis didn't paskin that way. Overturning the bed, the act of a mourner to overturn the bed, we generally don't do it anymore anyways. Um, but we see in one place in the Gemara that we have really this idea of where the 9 days comes in, except the Gemara, the practice to avoid meat and wine for the full 9 days is really a post-Talmudic innovation, as we see, because the Gemara itself does not mandate that. It only mandates it when we're talking about the Sudat Mafseket that mandated abstention from meat, wine, grape juice. And in fact, Yemenite Jews who follow the Gemara's rulings as understood and posted by the Rambam, Yemenite Jews, for instance, will never go 9 days without having meat and wine. They'll only avoid it the Sudat Mafseket because of the Gemara's teaching. Cutting hair, laundering clothing throughout the week, throughout the Shavua Shehalbo, would be sort of prohibited universally based on the Gemara. This year, we do not have a Shavua Shehalbo. Whenever Tisha B'Av falls on Sunday, whether the 9th of Av is actually Sunday or whether Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbos and it gets pushed off to Sunday, it's Nidche. In either case, there is no Shavua Shechalbo. And we'll see that there's a difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim when it comes to what do you do in that situation. So none of these restrictions, we'll just start by saying, for Sephardim and for Yemenites, for instance, there are none of these restrictions this week because there is no week in which Tisha B'Av occurs. There is no Shavua Shechalbo. It's considered also a bad time to have litigation with the guy because this is believed to be a period of bad mazel. It's considered auspicious to have a surgery. It's not a life necessary surgery. Like elective surgery, one should not try to get during this period. Lawsuits, etc. Now, the Gemara in Yevamot, Daf Mem Gimel on the base, the Gemara there also discusses some of the practices of Vedas. This is in the context of discussing when a man could be Makadesh and Isha. Right? When can a man get married? This comes up there. So let's look at the sugya there a bit. So, hey, Latanai, Fridatani, Merosh Chodesh, Varchatanit, Amtin, Megiskeichen, Milsa, Umilitan, Midivnot, Vilintoa, Umiliaris, Umilisa, Shabbat Shechal Tishva Petocha, Asur the Sapir Lechabes, Asur the Aris, Vayeshom, Kol Chodesh Asur. So the Gemara there says that the question that they're discussing is whether a person could marry a woman during the 9 days. And it says that this is subject to machloket tanayim, that there's a dispute whether this could be. That we've seen the brisa that during the 9 days from the from Rosh Chodesh Av, that from Rosh Chodesh Av um, through Tisha B'Av, it's prohibited to cut hair, to do laundry, and prohibited to get married. And some would say that this might even be true for the entire month of Av, which we do not hold by. But nonetheless, that was proposed. So there is this concept also that the public would restrain or restrict activities in trade or building or planting, things of that nature. And so that's typically how we observe. So the Aruch HaShulchan notes that it's sort of brought down the halacha, the Rif, the Rambam, the Rosh. They bring down the halacha, the Mishnah and Tainus, prescribing that one should minimize joy, but they all leave out this breita from Yevamos that we just talked about that lists certain activities that you shouldn't do. So the Aruch HaShulchan says that the breita only relates that the public restricts their activities in trade, building, and planting without employing the phrase us or without saying prohibited, which it uses regarding taking haircuts and washing clothes. So the Aruch HaShulchan says that really it's that the Gemara is not intending to prohibit these activities, but rather merely to relate the common practice, the self-imposed practice of the people. Right? So the Aruch HaShulchan, we'll look at the Aruch HaShulchan inside a bit. This is in Simon 551. He says as follows. He says that fundamentally we can understand the common practice not to completely refrain from these activities during the month of Av. Um, right, he says, "Ubashich Rambam lochus kirze, samachach b'chol hamoed, shabir de ein marvin simcha b'simcha, v'chein osur lis b'chol hamoed af below suda, ve'erisim mutar aval lo b'suda, v'chein shechatav matin b'simcha, v'meli yedena shechein kol kemo b'chol hamoed." So what's interesting is that he makes this connection between things that you can't do or things that would be discouraged during the 9 days in Chol Hamoed, which is interesting because during Chol Hamoed we don't launder. We don't cut nails. We don't do haircuts. We don't do disporit. We don't shave. So he makes the very interesting point that during the 9 days, we're avoiding things that would not be done during Chol HaMoed. V'kol machem divrei Rambam achsim shechare b'yevamot sham shnenu b'shnei braisos the Rosh Chodesh ad Chatanit chem amatim maskichem Ismilten vanos Toa so on and so forth. Goes on to say that during the 9 day period, um, it's more so that the common practice would not reflect what the Gemara in Yevamos is saying, and he'll give another suggestion here also. So the Aruch HaShulchan suggests that these activities actually cannot be done on communal fast days that were instituted because of severe drought. So the Rambam in Hilchot Taniyot, Perek Gimel Halacha Chet, brings this halacha explicitly, says the Aruch HaShulchan. So the Rambam there notes something interesting. He says that if you have these fast days that were set up because of drought, right? It's an Eitzara. He says we're supposed to do as follows. If public prayer is not effective, he says "Avrei lo nanu mematim b'masam matan v'ninshal simcha k'gon tzir v'chir and tiyashal simcha k'gon minei chadasim minei achadim matim v'erisim v'insun elim kain lo kiyum mitzvah previa v'ruvia kol mish kain mitzvah previa sir lo l'shamish mitada b'shnei reimon matim b'shalat shalom bein adam l'chavero. Are you not allowed to give shalom shalom? You're not supposed to greet people. Right, we don't do that until Shabbat, at least. But Talmidei Chacham lo yishal shalom ela kitzuvin imnudin hamakom v'em charet shenatan lachem shalom machzirin lo b'sefer rafa v'choved rosh. So the Rambam there says that minimizing commercial activity, construction projects associated with joy, like making a decorative pattern on ceilings or walls, plantings associated with joy, minimizing marriages unless one did not engage in pruruvru. Says if a person has children, a man fulfilled this mitzvah in the situation of such a fast, he shouldn't have sexual relations in such a year of famine at all. Not exchanging greetings. This is the way that one should conduct themselves on a communal fast day. Why? The Aruch HaShulchan suggests that the law in these days differs from those observed during the month of Av. We'll say during the month of Av, only trade, building, and planting that are for joyous purposes would be prohibited. Those activities are all subsumed under the phrase "Mishunech Nesab Mamitim B'Simcha." And the Torah learns from this that it's only when building and planting and trade are done for joyous purposes that it would be asa, not for all purposes. So that Bryce and Yevamos is not really halacha l'maisa for us. So practically speaking, though, we would say that when you do things for joyous purposes, it would be prohibited. Unnecessary projects in the home and in the garden, buying furniture, appliances, and other objects not necessary for business that are only for one's personal enjoyment. When a person, though, finds a deal to avoid a financial loss, right? We say the Torah Chasim Yisrael, that the Torah has mercy on the money of the Jewish people. You find a deal, it's a business purposes, Kedei Parnasato, says the Mishnah Berurah, then we could be Megal. So for Ashkenazim, in a year such as this, and I don't want to take up too much time on this more than necessary, but for Ashkenazim, um, there's there are 9 days prohibitions this year. So eating meat, having wine, haircuts, all the things that our Sublintinus mentioned, hair cutting and laundry, um, which the Mishnah teaches would be prohibited during the week in which Tisha B'Av falls. So Sephardim do not consider when Tisha B'Av falls on a Sunday, they don't consider there to be a Shavua Shechalbo, a week in which Tisha B'Av falls. So for Sephardim, these prohibitions don't apply this year because Tisha B'Av falls on a Sunday. For Ashkenazim, they do. And the prohibition of laundering would also include not just doing laundry, but also wearing freshly laundered clothing. Most Rishonim against the Rambam and against Rashi hold that laundered clothing shouldn't be worn during the period of the 9 days. And the Shulchan Aruch would paskin that laundering clothing, as well as linens, handkerchiefs, tablecloths, towels, for all purposes, would be forbidden, as well as wearing clothing that was laundered before the 9 days. So this is why people will. Ramah says that you shouldn't even give your clothing to a non-Jewish launderer to have them clean during the 9 days. Right? The Ramah says that the Ashkenazim keep these prohibitions for the entire 9 days, not just during the Shavua Shechalbo. So laundering is a big one. Um, Generally, what people will often do is the stuff that they want to wear during the period of the 9 days, they'll put it on a brief time before Rosh Chodesh, then wear it during the 9 days. I should say that according to many poskim, socks, underwear, and undershirts, t-shirts are called big day zeya, meaning that undergarments are intended to absorb perspiration. These could be worn during the 9 days, even without being worn previously, just like there's a heter. There's generally more of a permission, even in Chol Hamoed, to launder these things, unlike other garments that would be considered to actually be, like laundering. So washing sheets, to do the mitzvah of Chnasis Orchim, etc. These are all, all practices that are kept. The Ramah says that a person should not wear Shabbos clothing for Shabbos Chazon, but we don't follow that. Laundering clothing, laundered clothing, rather fresh clothing, we would even wear on Shabbos Chazon. We don't do anything really that would look like public availus, public mourning on Shabbos, as the Mishnah Berurah says. And so that is the prevalent practice nowadays. Um, the Rambam says that he says that all of Klal Yisrael, this is in Hilchot Tanit, Parakeh, Halacha, um, Vav. He says that the minhag, the practice of the Jewish people, is was accepted to abstain from eating meat or entering a bathhouse during the entire week until after the fast. That there are places that don't even do shechita from Rosh Chodesh Av until after the fast. I suspect nowadays the demands of the kosher meat industry and all the siyumim that people make wouldn't necessarily allow for that. Um, He says, "Bar nachagu Yisrael shelo the chol basar b'Shabbat so v'lo lo yichansu b'merchatz ad sheyavor chatanit." We don't go into the bathhouse. We don't eat meat until after the fast is over. Um, would that apply? So the Achronim say that the Rambam is talking about the week of Tisha B'Av, and he's talking about bathing in hot water in the bathhouse. So by the Spartam, at least, because we should refrain from bathing in hot water. Even by Ashkenazim, who would say that we're not really supposed to bathe this week, is just like a mourner would not bathe. Even for a person mourning, we differentiate between bathing for pleasure and bathing for hygienic purposes. The Chamavadia, he once famously quipped that people that would abstain from bathing this week, all bathing, and not make a distinction in people that would just not wash the body at all. In the summer months, he says that they're guilty of violating the mitzvah, that they're not loving their neighbors themselves because they're subjecting people to having to smell their unwashed bodies. So, mild bathing, I would say, is permitted. For Ashkenazim, meat and wine should be avoided. Laundering should be avoided until after Tisha B'Av, until after midday, the day after, on Monday. Haircuts, shaving, beard trims, even getting nails done should all be avoided until after Tisha B'Av. Now, practically, when Tisha B'Av falls on Sunday, um, we have some modification of things. So basically, when Tisha B'Av falls on Sunday, as it does this year, we don't have a special Sudat HaMafseket. We don't have a special pre-fast meal before the fast. We have just Sudat Shlishit. We have just the third meal of Shabbat. Um, and no special Sudat HaMafseket. Um, Also, Havdalah gets postponed until Sunday night. So we'll explain. So at Mincha time, we do not say Zitkatcha. Um, Even at Sudat Shlishit, we have meat and wine. There's no, right, it's not a Sudat Mafseket, as the Mishnah in Tainit says, so we could have meat and wine at Sudat Shlishit. Um, After halachic midday, certain restrictions apply. So after halachic noon, you may not go out for a walk on like a Shabbos walk, a stroll you may not do. After halachic midday, it's considered praiseworthy to limit oneself to portions of the Torah that one can learn on Tisha B'Av. Eicha, Eov, Laws of Avelus, reviewing some of the keynote of Tisha B'Av. Although we would say that you are allowed all day to read the Parsonage translation. You're allowed to be Mavir Sedra to do Shnayim Mikra V'Chatardim. That would not be a problem. Um, Most shuls, we won't do a communal sudat shlishit. It should be had at home. Um, it should be somewhat of a subdued mood. And a person has to stop eating and drinking before sunset, since this is when the fast begins. Um, so all of the prohibitions begin at sunset, except sitting on a chair and wearing shoes. So sunset, you can't you can't eat or drink, you can't wash, anoint. When nightfall comes in, so when we daven Marav on Saturday night, you get by Baruch Hu, that's when that's when you have to change the shoes into shoes that are not leather. And person can't sit on a regular chair. They have to be on a low chair. So practically, how does this work? So changing shoes. Not really supposed to wear non-leather shoes on Shabbos. Not supposed to mourn publicly on Shabbos. Um, Not supposed to get ready on Shabbos or after Shabbos. It's Chachanus. So what people will generally do is they can bring their shoes. They can bring their shoes. Um, you have to basically bring suitable footwear to shul before Shabbos or after Shabbos. So where a person davens Friday afternoon is where they have to daven Saturday night this year, because even with an Erev, you can't carry the shoes on Shabbos because you're not wearing them on Shabbos. Um, so what do we do for Havdalah? So obviously by saying Baruch Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol, that lets you do Malacha. Making Havdalah is what you have to do in order to eat. So you cannot make the blessing of Borim Nebasamim. You can't make the blessing over spices on Tisha B'Av because it's a pleasure that we're supposed to refrain from. What people will often do is um, before Mariv, before or in Shul before Eicha, before we read Lamentations, we would say the blessing over a Havdalah candle. Um, and after fast is over Sunday night, then they can make the full Havdalah. Ideally, not with wine or grape juice, but something that's considered Chamar Medina, like beer or liquor or something like that would be considered ideal. But even some opinions would say grape juice or wine should even be used for the purpose of the mitzvah of Havdalah. Person who cannot fast for medical reasons, they have a mitzvah to eat. They should say Havdalah. They should say a full Havdalah before they eat. They shouldn't recite Havdalah immediately after Shabbos. They should say Baruch Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol. Then, when the person feels like they need to eat, that's when they should make Havdalah. Um, so it's pretty late this year. If a person, needs to eat, they eat Shabbos, the third meal, they eat a good gesunta third meal, and they're going to go to bed relatively early the night of Tisha B'Av, then they would say Baruch Hamavdum and Kodesh L'chol so that they could do malacha like turning on a light switch or whatnot. But they would actually not make Havdalah, let's say, until they were to have breakfast in the morning. Um, so that's a decent overview, I think, of what we need to know this year. Even though there's no Shavua Shechalbo, laundering and haircuts best avoided during the 9 days, even for Svardim. And we have to remember also that that Chazal say that a person who mourns the Beis Hamikdash, person who mourns the temple, will merit that the temple should be rebuilt. And in this foot of our Velus, um, we daven that the Beis Hamikdash be rebuilt and that the Mashiach come to Meira. So now we'll move on to Parshas Devarim, and we'll talk about the importance of going upward, of having a spiritual aliyah, basically. Um, that stagnation, staying put, stuckedness, as we call it, not moving forward. We see that as really being um, a sign that something is, and not necessarily even in Jewish terms, but even in sort of psychological or counseling terms, when people feel stuck, when people feel like they're not moving anywhere in life, they're not getting ahead, this is not necessarily a positive thing. It's indicative of some sort of an existential dilemma or crisis, or um, or just a sign that things are not functioning in the life of the individual, perhaps as they should. And we'll see in our Parsha, Devarim, the importance of always moving onwards and upwards. So we begin the final book of the Torah, which is really a detailed account of Moshe Rabbeinu's swan song to Klal Yisrael. It's a long rebuke, basically. It's a pedagogical instruction about past mistakes to inform a better future. And the first thing that Moshe Rabbeinu gives the people to Chachma about, he rebukes them about how the exodus from Egypt, Yetzias Mitzrayim, it should have really led straight to Eretz Yisrael. It only turned into a winding 40-year journey through the desert due to the sins of the people. So the parsha begins, Eli Advarim Asher Diber Moshe El Kol Yisrael Be'ever HaYarden B'Midbar Ba'arava Mol Suf Vein Paranu Vein Tofel V'Levan V'Chatzerot V'Di Zahav. That these are the words that Moses spoke to the Jewish people on the other side of the Jordan in the desert and the plain opposite the Red Sea, between Paran and Tofel and Lebanon and Chazerot and Di Zahav. Achadasar Yom Me Chorev Derech Har Seir Ad Kadesh Barnea. That it's 11 days journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Vehi ba'arbaim shana b'ashtei asar chodesh ve'echad l'chodesh diber Moshe b'nei Yisrael kechol asher ziva Adonai otol aleihem. That it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first of the month, that Moshe spoke to the Bnei Yisrael according to all that God had commanded him regarding them. After he had spent Sichon melech HaMori asher yoshe b'cheshbon ve'et Og melech HaBashan asher yoshe b'ashtarot be'edrei. After he had spent Sichon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and Og melech HaBashan, king of the Bashan, who dwelt in Ashtarot and Edrei. Be'ever Hayardain Beretz Moab Chalil Moshe be'eret Chatorah Chizot Lemor. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses commenced and explained this law, saying, Hashem Elokeinu diber eleinu b'chorev lemor, Rav Lachem shevet b'char hazeh. God spoke to us in Horeb, saying, you have dwelt long enough at this mountain. Penu usu lachem vo charchem morive el kol shepnav, ba'arva v'har u'v'chvela u'v'negev u'v'chol chayam, eretz ha'kanani v'lebanon ad ha'nachar ha'gadol nachar parat. Turn and journey and come to the mountain of the Amorites and to all its neighboring places. in the plain, on the mountain, and in the lowland, and in the south, and by the seashore, the land of the Canaanites, and the Lebanon, until the great river, the Euphrates. Right, natati lifnechem et haaretz bo'u urshu et haaretz asher nishba Hashem avotechem. Lavraham liyitzak liyakov v'teit lechem u'lizaram acharechem. See, I have set the land before you. Come and possess the land that Hashem swore to your forefathers, to Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, to give them their descendants after them. So there are other elements to the speech, of course, but we can see how Moshe is highlighting this sticking point, that the journey to Eretz Yisrael from Mitzrayim is very short, and Hashem had instructed them to immediately conquer the land. Rashi points out as follows here. He says, Zachar asar yom mechorav, amar lechem Moshe, Re'uma garamtem ein lechem derech kitzara mechorav l'kadosh b'nei kederech har seir, v'af hu Mahalech Yud Aleph Yom. ואתם הלכתם אותו בשלושה ימים, וכל כך הייתה שכינה מתלבטת בשבילכם למכר ביאתכם לארץ. That it is 11 days' journey from Horeb. And Moshe said to them, see what you caused. There's no shorter route from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea than the way through Mount Seir, and even that is a journey of 11 days. But you traversed it in 3 days, and to such an extent did the Shekhinah exert itself to hasten your arrival to Eretz Canaan, to the land of Canaan. Uvishvil shekilkaltem, hisevetchem sevivot har seir arba'im shana, but because you sinned, Hashem made you travel around Mount Seir for 40 years. So we're going to focus on one particular comment from Rashi. The words in Pasuk Vav, you have dwelt long enough at the mountain. So Rashi will offer 2 explanations. One, right, we're going to focus on what Rashi, I apologize for that break. We had to answer the door, but we're going to focus on what Rashi says there in Pasuk Vav. Are you dwell long enough at the mountain? Rashi there, we'll see, offers 2 explanations. Rab lachem Shabbat ki peshuto, v'yesh midrash agadah harbe gedola lachem v'sacharet yeshivatchem b'char hazeh, asitem mishkan menorah v'kelim, kibaltem Torah menitem lachem Sanhedrin sari lafum v'sari meot. So you've dwelt long enough at the mountain. He says this is supposed to be understood according to its simple meaning, but he says that we also have an explanation from Agartha, from sort of legend. I've given you much greatness and reward for your having dwelt at this mountain. You made the Mishkan, the menorah, the other vessels, furnishings. Right, you received the Torah. You appointed a Sanhedrin for yourselves, and captains over thousands and captains over hundreds. So the first explanation interprets the words literally. You've been at this mountain for too long. In other words, after receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people should have immediately turned their eyes towards Eretz Yisrael and sort of made a beeline to Eretz Kodshenu. But instead, they dilly-dallied there for too long, displeasing God. And the second explanation takes the opposite approach, rendering the words, "You've really achieved great things here." So essentially, each is interpreting the abundance, quote unquote, of the word Rav differently. So what is Rashi trying to tell us by saying Kippishuto? Why does Rashi get into Medrash here? Why does he give us this explanation that looks at it positively, saying that you've done all of these great things here? And why does he single out the menorah um, of the Beis Hamikdash in the second explanation? So, got to look at the word Rav. So throughout the Torah, the word Rav doesn't actually mean abundant, but rather it means enough. And when we say enough, it's not usually enough isn't sufficient, which is a positive sentiment, but it's rather enough in the way that in modern Hebrew we say die, or um, or in the way Yiddish we would say genugt, meaning like enough of that, knock it off, like too much. This connotation matches with the literal meaning of the word in the sense of abundance, right? So it's like saying, for instance, like genugt, knock it off. You're doing this bad thing in abundance, you're bothering your little sister in abundance. Genugt, knock it off. Right? So let's look at another example of this term in the Torah where we'll see how this is indeed the meaning of the word. So this example takes us back to the dusty plains of the desert where we see that Korach had just staged a mutiny against Moshe. And in the first real challenge to Moshe's leadership, this descendant of Levi rose up and tried to usurp Moshe Rabbeinu's position. Right? So we all know this sort of false egalitarianism, right? Kadoshim Haim, we're all holy, so who are you, Moses, to claim superiority? So, like all populists who use language of equality to grab positions of power for themselves, Korach was trying to grab the coveted priesthood for himself. It's almost as laughable to me as the fact that we have somebody running for mayor of New York City. It's like capitalism for me, communism for the rest of you. Um, the guy's promising everything for free. Meanwhile, his parents are multimillionaires, and he just got married in a palace in Uganda. Um, okay, and in a way that this is sort of the same populism of Korach. Um, he was really only out to grab the kahuna, to grab the coveted priesthood for himself. So it's a long story with a fantastical ending, but we're going to keep the focus narrow and zoom in on what Moshe Rabbeinu's initial reply was to Korach. So Rashi uses the word Rav Lachem here, or he comments on the words Rav Lachem. This is Rashi on the Midbar Parak Yud Zayin. I'm sorry, Tes Zayin. Plus the Gimel. Rav, Rav Lachem Charbe Yoter Midah V'Kachtem V'Atzmechem Gedula. You take too much for yourselves, meaning you took by far too much greatness for yourselves. So there it is, right? Korach, my dear cousin, you did enough more than you could chew. Moshe told him, so watch out. What's relevant to the discussion is the word Rav, which clearly means too much in this context. Which begs the question in this case, if the word Rav means too much, it's difficult to understand why Moshe felt it was overdone in our current context in Devarim. Right? What could be so bad about hanging out by Mount Sinai for so long, by Har Sinai? Why was that too much? What could possibly be wrong about sticking around a bit longer and basking in Hashem's glow on Sinai? And this is where Rashi comes in with one word, Kippishuto. He answers this question. So remember, Pshat is not just the way we literally translate a verse, but it's also the overall context of all the surrounding verses, the broader story. And so the context is Moshe telling them off for delaying entry into Israel. So let's look on our pasuk in the from the Kli Yakar. Great commentary. I think Art Scroll is starting to come out with it. So let's see what the Kli Yakar has to say. Rav Lechem Shevet B'char Zeh Nusu Lechem. So Tochacha Rishona. Al Shanashim Snei Haaretz. From the Yashvu B'char Zeh Yeshiva Shokeva V'lo Panu Pneihem El Haaretz Makom Meyuchad L'Kiyum Mitzvot. We've dwelt long enough at this mountain turn and journey. Says the Kli Yakar, this is the first rebuke, the first L'chacha, because the people despised the land and they chose to settle permanently on this mountain instead of turning their attention to the land, which is the special place for fulfilling mitzvahs, to keep a mitzvahs. Rav Lechem Chumilshon Rav Lechem B'nei Levi Kavomar Chameat Chu Chamered V'Hama'al Chazeh Ki Rav Chu Be'emet Lechem Inyan Shabbat Yeshiva Shokeva B'Har Hazeh Penu Chasibu P'neichem El Haaretz. Too much for you is similar to the phrase too much for yourselves, B'nei Levi, children of Levi, which means, is it not enough that you're rebelling and going against the proper path? The truth is, sitting permanently on this mountain is not right for you. Turn your faces towards the land. So considering this specific context, staying at the mountain, even for noble pursuits, would not be noble at all. That Hashem made it clear that the marching orders were to get out and make their way to Eretz Yisrael as soon as possible. So anything delaying that goal, no matter how holy the intention behind it, was unjustified and thus was worthy of rebuke. In Kutei Sichos, the Lubavitcher Rebbe says that here, and we're going to read this just in translation, we're not going to read the Yiddish. So the Rebbe there says that here, Moshe wanted to explain to the Jewish people the progression of events, starting from their situation at the time of receiving the Torah, up until their current situation on the other side of the Yarden. He emphasized that the emes, the Yidden should have entered Eretz Yisrael shortly after being on Mount Sinai, but it was only because of the sin of the spies, Chet HaMeraglim, that they were delayed in the desert for so long. Therefore, it must be pointed out, says the Rebbe, that even back then, when the Jewish people were still on Mount Sinai, Hashem told them that they should go straight to the land of Israel. And based on this, it's clear why the verse says, you've dwelt long enough at this mountain. It emphasizes how strongly Hashem wished for the Jewish people to immediately enter Eretz Yisrael, despite the great merits that came from their stay at Mount Sinai. Gathering there too long without moving forward was too much. But at the end of the day, the student of Rashi is not entirely satisfied because the Jewish people only traveled in the desert by Hashem's word. Right, a literal cloud guided them in the desert, so the Jews hit the road only when the cloud did so ahead of them. So how could Moshe rebuke them for staying on Mount Sinai if they weren't instructed to leave? If they didn't receive instructions from Hashem to leave, that means they were supposed to be there, so why admonish them? So that's why Rashi cites the Medrash that reinterprets the word Rav. In this Midrashic rendering, the word is no longer too much, but rather a lot, in a good way. But let's not forget the context that we've been discussing about, namely Moshe's discussion about the immediacy of entering the land after the Exodus, after Yetzias Mitzrayim. So even in the Midrashic rendering, this context doesn't change, thus fitting this Medrash squarely within Rashi's framework of Pshat. We're still talking about Moshe telling the Jews how everything had been set up for them to quickly enter the land. So how does that fit with the Medrash? So let's look at the Medrash again. It tells us about specific things that the Jewish people did to cement their holy identity as Jewish people. And here's the important thing to understand, that these elements were all critical conditions for the people to enter the land. Right? A holy land called for a holy people with a holy identity. Right? These elements needed to be in place prior to entry. And this is why Rashi singles out the menorah as the article with which the Jewish people were rewarded for being at Mount Sinai. The menorah was unique in how it represented the notion that Hashem dwelled among the people, bestowing upon them their sacred identity. So this is Rashi on Vayikra Chav Daled Pasuk Gimel. Rashi says, "For Rabbeinu Drashu al Ner Maravi, Shu'edu lechol ba'eolam shechshchina shora b'Yisrael, shenotim b'Hashem kemidat chavrutecha, u'mimena haya matchil uva haya mesayim. That our Chachamim taught about the Ner Maravi, the Western lamp, that it was a testimony to all the creatures on earth that the Shekhinah rested upon Israel, on the Jewish people, because the Kohen Gadol would place into it the same amount of oil that he placed into the other lamps, and from it he would begin kindling, and with it he would finish the cleaning, since it continued to burn miraculously until the following evening. So the menorah is the quintessential example of what was accomplished on Har Sinai and in the Midbar prior to entering the land. It exemplified how the Jewish people were forming as Hashem's nation, holy people destined to serve as divine ambassadors upon the earth. This was a critical exercise to undergo before entering the land, because only then could the people maintain and solidify that identity in their new home. And we could see how both things are true, that the point was to get to Israel as quickly as possible. And to do that properly, the Jewish people needed time to mature in the desert and grow into their new sacred identity. So, because we know the broader context, it makes sense, right? So too long, Rashi lands with Kippishuto, follow the plain meaning of the text, which includes the broader context from which we can understand that Moshe was voicing his displeasure that the people did not immediately travel to the Holy Land. So ultimately, it's unsatisfying because we know that the people only traveled when Hashem told them. So Rashi brings the medrash that interprets the word Rav Lechem or Rav as sort of abundant merit, framing the people's delay at the mountain and in the desert as necessary, maybe even laudable steps towards cementing their identity as an Am Kadosh, as a holy nation who could therefore enter the land. So there's an important message contained here, and we could extract this from Rashi's words as if we read them as one line without any interpretation. We've sat long enough, literally. So that's it. In his header, Rashi doesn't cite the words at this mountain, thus gifting us a very memorable, teachable line that if you're sitting for a long time, it's already too much, period. So it's very simple that a Jew must always be making progress in some way. And that if we're stuck in one place, no matter how lofty, holy, pristine, or noble it is, it's too much. It's time to move on and graduate to the next level. The Rebbe in Likkutei Sichos says a yid darf weisen, as a matzah von Shabbos, bleiben sitzen auf in Art, stein auf, the Rega, the Baruch, und nicht gehen weiter. When is Rav Lachem, Kipshuto, Harbe Yoter, the Medai. So the Rebbe says that a Jew has to understand that a state of sort of stagnation, sitting, staying in one place, remaining on the same level in Avodas Hashem and serving Hashem, not progressing or striving higher. Rav Lachem, it's enough for you, and it's simple meaning. It's too much. Harbe Yoter Medai. It's too much. Lagutten Choich soll sich wechsel wurde, is über Hemmscher Zman von Beleiben Seiten auf der selbe der Regel ist. Wir werden auf dem dieselbe Zeit. Ich darf seine Mahalach. Geseder schaffen sie so ein Mingan Eretz Lachen, Malim B'Kodesh. This principle, Malim B'Kodesh, always going holier. And that's the principle for the menorah, even Hanukkah, why you increase the number rather than decrease it. Behil not Shammai, Malim B'Kodesh. So says the Rebbe, no matter how good and high one's level of Avodas Hashem might be, staying in that place for too long is giving up too much time, that a person has to be on a journey, constantly striving and moving higher, ascending in holiness, Malim B'Kodesh. And this is the hallmark of humanity, growth and progress. Stagnation and status quo are for angels or for Mason, and we're neither. Chazal and Brachos Daf Samach Dalet on Aleph convey this idea beautifully. Amar Bichia Barashi Amar Rab Tamid Chamin Nachem Menucha Lo Ba'olam Hazeh V'Lo Ba'olam Haba. Shemar Yeluchu Mechayel L'Chayel Yirei Elokim B'Tzion. There's this idea that Rav here Barashi brings from Rav, saying that a Talmud Chochem, that the scholars of Torah, they have rest neither in this world nor in the world to come, because in both worlds they're constantly striving and progressing. As it says, they go from strength to strength. Every one of them appears before Hashem at Zion, constantly striving for growth, constantly seeking to do more. And the Maharal brings this idea in the context of intellectual pursuit, but we'll see that this would apply for all human affairs. So the Maharal in Nesivos Olam, Nesiv HaTorah, Perek Tes, says as follows. The Maharal says, Ein ha-perish chas v'sholem she'en lachem menucha, ki bevada yesh lachem menucha. Avar etzalomer ki mala talmid chacham ein shlama bo, ki ein ach-seichel bo lidei shlama, ki ein tachlid v'sofa el ha-chasaga, she'im hisig devar echad, efshar l'hasigot or l'chach ein ha-seichel el shlama. So, explaining this Gemara, the Sagadata, the Maharal says it doesn't mean, the Gemara doesn't mean to say that a Talmud Chacham never has rest. Obviously, they do. Of course, they have menucha. It's certain. What it means, says the Maharal, is that the level, the milas of a Talmud Chacham, ain't a there's never a flamus to it. It's never fully complete. The intellect doesn't reach a state of perfection, he says, because there's no end or limit to understanding that. Once a person grasps one thing, it's always possible to understand more, and therefore the intellect never reaches completion, right? Cogito, right? Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But really, it's more so that when Cartesian dualism, he says, I know, therefore I don't know, therefore I know. That, intelligence might really lie in having the humility to say, I don't know. And as noted, the Maharal, he applies this idea to really all human endeavors. In Derech Chaim, base Ches, he says as follows, the Maharal Derech Chaim, he says, Ha'adam nivra le'amal shelo yeh ba'al hanacha klal, rak yotzei shlemato el hapoel tamid b'li hanacha, shekach roi mitzad tevach habriya shekolcha nivraim nivru sheyiyu b'shleimus, lo yihu cheserim v'adam hazeh iya shen shiba el ha'hashlama ad sheyihe ba'al hanacha v'gamri. Says a person was made to work, to be amal, to toil, not to rest. That we're meant to manifest our potential always without ever stopping, that this is the natural order of creation. Everything was created to be whole, not lacking. Created to be mali, not chazer, meaning to be whole, not incomplete or lacking. And he says a person cannot reach that sense of wholeness unless they're fully engaged and active. Adam never le mal shlo yi balanacha klar rak yotze shlom toil poel tamid bli chanacha shekach rei mitzad teva chabriya shekol chanivraim nivru shi b'shleimut. We read that already. My apologies. Let me pull up the remainder of the Maharal for you. Tis the Maharal. He says, "V'zeh shlemato b'atzmo shechu mitnoea ela poel lo tzi shlemato tamid ela poel v'davar zeh hu shlemato v'kemo shemayim asher hein mitnoeim ואינם באים אל החנכה כלל, גם אי אפשר לכם שיהיו בלי תנועה, והתנועה היא שלמתם. וכך הוא אדם שלא נברא מתחילת בריאתו בעל ההנחה, וגם שהיה בשלמות, גם אינו בתכלית עמלו על השלמות וההנחה, רק זה שלמתו מצד יציאתו אל הפועל תמיד. Says this is what true completeness looks like, always in motion, constantly bringing potential into action. Says the Maharal, it's like the sky. Which is always moving and never comes to rest. It can't exist without movement. The movement itself is what makes it complete. And so a person was not created to rest, right? We always say, you can't let a person rest on their laurels, right? If you kind of maybe build up a person too much or put too much praise on a person, then they get complacent. The Maharal would say that the idea is to never get complacent. A person wasn't created to rest or to be fully complete from the beginning. It says they can't reach the end of their work in a state of rest and perfection. Their completeness comes from always striving, constantly bringing potential into reality. So Rav Kook, actually, Rav Avram Yitzhak Kook in Ein Ayah, brilliant, beautiful book. Ein Ayah is Rav Kook's writings on Agadata. He reads this idea into the Gemara itself. So Rav Kook comments on the Gemara and Brachos that we brought, Daf Samech Dalet Amud Aleph, for Return Veda Talmid Chacham never having rest. So Rav Kook says, "Ha'onig midachis l'chol davar al pi techunato, sheshlemut hakochot hapolim kol shelo yeh lachem kol yikuv u'miniya milifol pe'ulatam, v'shavitat ha'pe'ulah hu neged chukam v'hafach yidunam." That pleasure is connected to everything according to its nature. The completeness of active powers is that nothing can prevent or block them from carrying out their function. Resting from action goes against their nature and purpose. Talmidei Chachamim המושפעים מכוח עצמם ועומדים להשפיע ולנהל את זולתם. זאת היא עצם תכונת נפשם להיות פועלם, וכן אם גם והשלמתם היא רק הפעולה התדירה והמתקיימת. That for Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, they're influenced by their own strength and they stand ready to influence and guide others. This is the essential nature of the neshama, of the neshama of the Talmid Chacham, to be active, to always strive and grow in Torah. You see all the certificates I have on the wall in the shul, constantly to be learning in more smicha, more smichas, more learning, more Torah, more halacha, more hara. That is the nature of the Talmid Chacham, or a person who strives to be one, to always grow, to always learn more. One more Rashi, one more Tosfos, one more Shach, one more Taz. And so, for such people, their pleasure and fulfillment, says Rav Kook, it only comes from constant and ongoing action. תכלית עידונם היא התנועה המתמדת והפעולה שאינה פוסקת, ולכו מחיל אל חיל. That is why the ultimate enjoyment for them is in continuous movement and action that never stops. They go from strength to strength. This is the way of the Torah scholar. And this is an important point to remember about the human race, not only an inspiring message to do more, but also a cautionary tale. By staying put, we squander further potential. We run the risk of falling backward, even. It's like a treadmill. If you're not moving forward, you're automatically going backward. The Vilna Gaon, the Bir Hagran, Mishlei, Pasuk, Perek, Perek Tes Vav, Pasuk Chof Dalet. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 24. The Vilna Gaon says as follows in his commentary there. He says, Adam nikra cholech shezoich lilach tamid, vidaga l'darga, v'im lo ya'alei l'mada, yord mata chas v'shalom, ki bilti yashar sheyamod b'darga chada. Says the Vilna Gaon, a person is called a mover because they must always move from one level to the next. If they don't keep rising, they'll fall. God forbid, because it's impossible to stay on one level forever. And the Baal HaPlah, Pinchas Horowitz, in Panim Yafot, he echoes. So the Panim Yafot is his parish on the Torah. The Haflah is and Hamakne are his chedushim on Shas. So the Panim Yafot on Shemos Perek Tes Zion Pasuk Daled says as follows. He says, Ki Chadam Nikra Hashem Ze Mahalik. Says a person is called a mover because the verse says, brings the pasuk from Zechariah that says, I have given you a mover among those who stand. Valmarot, it also says, it also says that the path in our pasuk from Mishlei that the Vilna Gaon commented on, the path of life is upward for the wise to turn away from the grave below. Ki chamida ein ladam kimocha malachim chenigraim ometim, ki b'chol chidushim mechadesh adam lamita shel Torah, hu ole lamala kimo shamar hakatuv yom liyom yabia omer. That standing still is not for a person, like the angels who are called standers, because whenever a person innovates something new, they make a chiddush. Person is mechadesh in the realm of Torah. They make a chiddush. They rise higher, as the pasuk says, from one day to the next to the other speech. If chas v'shalom yifnei mimenu yored lamata v'zehu ma shekatuv v'mansur mishol mata ki im eino ole mimela yored while shem ze nikra mahalach. If God forbid he or she turns away from this, they fall. And this is why it says to turn away from the grave below, because if they don't rise, they naturally fall. And this is why a person is called a mover. Yesh tefarish bazeh ma shema Rav Yosef. Le'olam lo amarti devar v'chazarti le'achorai. Ki she'yezakechu Hashem la'alot b'malot haTorah l'chadesh ba. S'chameot shelo yachzor l'acharav. This is why he says, we could explain what Rav Yossi says in the Gemara Masechah Shabbos, Tav Chof Yud Ches on the base. I've never spoken a word and then gone back on it. That when Hashem grants a person the ability to rise through the levels of Torah and to be mechadesh, to innovate in it, right? To make chedushim in Torah, a person has to be very careful not to turn back. And he continues the Panim Yafot, also in Shemos Perek Lamed Gimel Pasuk Chaf, Exodus 33, verse 20. He says, "Sha'adam shechu zadik nikra machalach, u'malach nikra omed, kedachtiv v'natati lecha achrim ben omdim ha'elei, v'hatam ki adam cholech mimadrega lemadrega, kimo she'amru chachaminu zichronim levracha, v'midei chachamim kol zman shemazkinim datam me'yoshevet alehem, aval malachim omdim b'madrega achat le'olam." A righteous person is called a mover, an angel is called a stander. As the pasuk in Zechariah says, I've given you walks among those who stand. The reason for this is that a person moves from one level to the next. As the Chachamim say, Meseches Kinim, As the Talmidei Chachamim grow older, their understanding becomes more settled. But angels stand on the same level forever. And in this way, to be human is to be more divine than to be an angel. So never stop moving is really the message. Um, People very often get complacent. They get comfortable in routines. They decide it's good enough. And complacency helps us to stop growing. Very often people find I have a family, I have a job, I have a house. What do I have to strive for in life? Um, right. Sometimes we look at people from the outside, we say, oh, he or she made it. But a person spiritually can be stagnant, really. Um, People are often stuck in situations that are just very tragic, unhealthy. Toxic jobs we hate, bad employers, toxic relationships, bad relationships it's not so easy to get out of, bad habits we can't break. We often feel hopeless and wonder when the right time will come to make a change. But there is no perfect time, quote unquote. We only have now. Every moment we wait is a moment we're not living to our full potential. That again, that all we have is now, today, 24 hours in a day. We have no day but today, right? If you've ever seen the show on Broadway, Rent, no day but today. Um, Very, very powerful song, I think. Um, we're given today, no day but today to make the most of the day that we're given. Only now, only here, no other path, no other way. It's a song that seems kind of trite, but there is, this garment of truth, this figment of truth contained within it. Because every moment we wait is a moment we're not living up to the full potential. So we think about where we're stuck in our lives, the things that hold us back. And very often we have a tendency to want things to be perfectly aligned before we do anything. But really, we need to just take a small step forward now. Because as the Torah teaches us, as we see, the key is to not stay still, but to reach forward, to look for the higher madrega. To always move forward, the ruchnius and spiritual things and Torah and emotions and practicality. We always want to move forward and do more and do better. And if we're not moving, we're falling backwards. So um, that is the lesson that we, um, Bezras Hashem, will be able to internalize. And we hope everybody has a good week, as much as possible. And also, we should all have those who will be fasting. It should be an easy fast, a meaningful fast. It should be a meaningful day for all of us on Tisha B'Av. Shvuah Tov.